Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Whole parts, part wholes, and protein synthesis. Analytic philosophers and other hypocritical organisms. The men that Thomas Jefferson most admired were the great discoverers, not the great creators. His heroes had reduced the complexity of reality to simple principles. Not unlike Jefferson's own reductionistic principle, all men are created equal. Scientists and empiricist philosophers, not poets or prophets, mounted the Jeffersonian summit of human greatness. In a letter to artist John Trumbull on February 15, 1789, Jefferson wrote, "Bacon, Locke and Newton, whose pictures I will trouble you to have copied for me, and as I consider them as the three greatest men that have ever lived, without any exception, and as having laid the foundation of those superstructures which have been raised in the physical and moral sciences, I would wish to form them into a knot on the same canvas, that they may not be confounded at all with the other great men." For Nietzsche and many other German thinkers, it was men such as Bacon, Locke, and Newton that were responsible for the greatest herd philosophy of all, democracy. German resistance to democracy was connected to a fear that modern, mechanistic, hyper-analytic thinking in general was threatening to conquer and debase every facet of life into total materialism. The Nazis radicalized this general German attack on the mechanistic views that predominated in England. "We require that the mechanistic world picture be replaced by the organismic world picture." Needless to say, there are outstanding exceptions to this cultural generalization of German organism and English mechanistic materialism. German Johannes Kepler believed the celestial machine is to be likened not to a divine organism but rather to clockwork. English poet William Blake declared, "Art is the tree of life, science is the tree of death." Along with Lord Byron, Blake was among the English poets closest to the German Romantics. His Marriage of Heaven and Hell bears insights not unlike those central to Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. It was Nietzsche, however, who brought the problem of the conflict between objective and subjective views of life to the forefront. Where does the progress of the materialism and rationalism of Western civilization lead but nihilism? To the conclusion that life is meaningless and the choice of death is not fundamentally superior to the choice of life. We have art, Nietzsche declared, in order not to perish from the truth. But was the truth aimed to kill? Was scientific reductionism in England also used as a weapon to reduce the Normans that had reduced the Anglo-Saxons? Was this part of the modern politics of modern physics? In the theory of colors, Goethe tried to disprove Newton's analysis of white light as the sum of all colors, i.e. as when passed through a prism. While subsequently admired as a great poet, Goethe himself confessed, "As for what I have done as a poet, I take no pride in whatsoever. Blute in my century. I am the only person who knows the truth in the difficult science of colors. Of that, I say, I am not a little proud, and here I have a consciousness of superiority to many." 1170. Goethe's preference for the indivisible polar opposition of light and dark did not stand up to those who preferred Newton's scientific method. The poet's attempt to combine, in a single person, the objective and subjective views of nature was ultimately not successful. But what are the ultimate consequences for human culture if the objective methodology of the sciences completely dominate and define the human? Goethe once said that analysis and synthesis should be alternated as naturally as breathing in and out. What the Germans apparently saw in the English tradition was a breathing disorder. The hypertropic development of material analysis represented by Newton seemed to correspond with the loss of a human perspective. A man without parents, friends, or lovers, Newton set the standard, not only for modern physical science, but also for the modern, atomistic, isolated individual. The point here is not Newton's science isolated from his life, or Newton's life isolated from his science, but the socio-biological relationship between Newton's socially isolated life and his defining contribution to modern science. It appears that Newton gained a superlatively modern, to anthropomorphized perspective on the larger physical cosmos by losing much connection to other humans. The German belief in more Goethe, less Newton was related to the conviction that the dominance of the mechanistic, analytic empiricism of the English-speaking world was destructive to authentic culture, whereas Anglo-Saxon culture had been largely mutilated or destroyed by the Norman conquest. Its survival in Germany was correlated with belief in a super-individual socio-biological synthesis, whereas the destruction of Anglo-Saxon culture inclined towards inequality of the analytic and synthetic. German culture was dependent on an ultimate, net superiority of the synthetic over the analytic. The crude generalization that science is analytic and synthesis is unscientific is itself unscientific. Analysis emphasizes separation, while synthesis emphasizes combination. Combining 2 plus 2, for example, synthesizes 4. Newtonian physics synthesized discoveries of Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler while discarding others. Life, furthermore, is made possible by synthetic processes. The combination of sperm genes and egg genes into the novel DNA sequence of an embryo is a classic example of synthesis. The construction of a human child from the DNA code of an embryo is also an example of a process of synthesis. The survival of a human being is dependent on synthetic processes such as protein synthesis. Analytic philosophy is not analytical enough. The very existence of a philosopher of the analytic school, or a scientist skeptical of the very term synthesis, is dependent upon bodily processes such as protein synthesis. The most extreme analytic philosophers and scientists are thus hypocritical organisms whose existence is conditioned upon synthetic processes that they deny in theory but perpetuate in practice. Life itself is almost distinguishable from non-life by the ability of its constituent synthetic process to outcompete the analytic processes that would normally break life down into death. If analytic philosophers were more consistent, they would be lead to bring down the hierarchies of their own mind. The extension of synthetic processes from an individual organism to a social organism or superorganism is not fundamentally different from the evolutionary extension of single-celled life into a multicellular life that began about 1 billion years ago. In consequence, the modern, individual organism is just as holistic as the superorganism, since both are synthesized from parts that originated as wholes unto themselves. From this larger perspective, it becomes clear the modern idea of human rights assumes a form of holism on the level of the individual organism. Rights are resistant to both the superorganism on a higher level, and the reductionistic free fall of a multicellular organism into the physics of death. Human beings are material things. The idea that a human individual is distinct from and separate from matter at large is a holistic myth. Yet synthetic processes of life work in paradoxical relationship to analytic processes because natural selection effectually analyzed or chose certain synthetic processes over others. This implies that the most complex syntheses might incorporate an analytic blind spot related the preference of some synthetic organizations over others. A living thing cannot incorporate all physical possibilities into itself if it is to remain alive. Life, on some level, is an organization synthesis that contradicts, overcomes, or outsynthesizes the physical probabilities of its immediate environment that would otherwise lead to death. Just as the life processes of an individual bacteria cell could not exist if its cell walls were open to all the physical possibilities of its outside environment, German culture demonstrates a close, hermetic self-contextualization wherein thoughts contextualize one another and exert influence on one another like the way that amino acids contextualize one another in a protein. Just as protein synthesis requires close, probabilistic contextualization of amino acids, German socio-biological synthesis into an superorganism required a self-context that excluded certain extraneous possibilities. An unraveled protein is not equal to the sum of its parts from the perspective of the life that depends on it, and likewise, with the logic of a poet, Martin Heidegger was a last stand against the presumptions of modern reductionism. The Norman conquest introduced a brutal irony into the organic assumptional logic of the superorganism. For an superorganism, The political is the locus of social synthesis, wherein the activities of the social organism as a whole is unified and coordinated. Conquest reversed the political from a locus of social synthesis and unity, to the locus of social rupture and social disunity. Instead of pulling everyone together, the conquest began to tear voluntary political unity apart. The attitude of people towards government flipped from attraction to repulsion. This attitude of repulsion towards the political may be a source of the modern assumption that the uber-organismic whole has been broken in favor of the larger physical cosmos. In Newton's universe, for example, socio-biological priorities do not fundamentally override physical cosmology in the way that they apparently did for a voluntary Nazi such as Heisenberg. Contra the German Nazis' revolution, the very idea of modern Western revolution is like an immunological attack on the assumption of political sociobiological synthesis. The political is the classic locus of the convergence of the ties that bind the people, i.e. the Greek polis or city-state. The conquest, by contrast, represented the divergence of kinship and political power. The binding force of the political became the representation of the defeat of Anglo-Saxon political identity, not the representation of its combination. The Normans skillfully, systematically, and perpetually organized the thwarting of Anglo-Saxon attempts to reverse the conquest throughout medieval times. Anglo-Saxon democracy's resistance to synthesizing heredity and politics is a result of adaptation to conditions that the Normans enforced. The reversal of William the Conqueror's strategy of divide and conquer in modern times, partly through the strategy of the inorganic division of powers, represents the death of uber-organismic synthesis. Chapter break. Slime mold and Ubermensch is a human social uber-organism fundamentally more holistic than an individual human organism. Just as a human uber-organism can be broken down into individual organisms, an individual human can be broken down into individual cells. This does leave, however, a technical difference. The cells of a human individual are physically connected, while the human cells of a human social uber-organism are not, after birth, physically connected. Yet even this seemingly insuperable difference finds counterexamples in nature. Amoebas of the genus Dictyostelium are normally individualistic slime mold scavengers. When they have scoured a patch of soil clean of food, however, they send alarm signals to one another that collectively guide them together into what becomes, in effect, a single organism. The individual amoebas are thus transformed into an uber-organism, a slow-moving slug. The slug may then undergo another transformation in which about a fifth of its cells differentiate into a stalk made sturdy with rigid cellulose. This process rips apart and kills the amoebas that make up the stalk. The remaining majority of the cells take advantage of this suicide by going to the top of stalk and differentiating themselves into a spherical mass, becoming dormant spores. After waiting for outside forces such as rain to carry them to a more fertile area, the cells can re-emerge and start the life cycle over again. This is an example of individualistic self-interest being overridden by collective self-organization. While one might draw an analog with liberal democracies during war, this variety of slime mold has a strong kin-selective basis for its uber-organismic order, and thus analogies could be raised with Nazi socialism. Kin selection explains the correlation of greater kin discrimination and greater willingness for obedience unto death. Take the case of the German Nazis. What from one point of view is Kadavergehorsam, the corpse-like obedience of the German army, is from the point of the uber-organism the condition of its living existence. Some elements of a German's individuality must die, in the sense of being sacrificed for the social whole, for the individuality of the uber-organism to live. It is from this basic point of view that Westerners conventionally make a distinction between individualism and wholism. This categorical distinction, however, cannot survive a rigorous analysis. Romantic arguments for the life of the individual nation are no less tautological than Western arguments for individual self-preservation. An individual uber-organism is not fundamentally more holistic than an individual human organism that composes it, because every human is composed of individual cells subordinated to the organism as a whole. Henry David Thoreau or Abbie Hoffman, for example, would be incapable of being effective social dissidents if the neurons that composed their minds themselves dissented from the predictable cadaver or some corpse-like obedience that is a condition of having a viable, individual human mind. An individual human is itself a kind of uber-organism, a multicellular whole made possible by obedient neurons and other cells working together as a kind of team. It is from this perspective that the brain's mind has been compared to the social uber-organismic ant colony that emerges from the behavior of individual ants. 1171. The mind of an individual person is made possible by relations between individual neurons, and is thus not fully reducible to the sheer sum of individual neurons. By the same token, the more holistic notion of Hegelian reason is not fully reducible to the sheer summation of individual reasoners that formally define the methodology of Anglo-Saxon liberal democracy. The Hegelian model implicitly requires an emphasis on the relationships between individuals, which the Nazis explicated as kinship or racial relations. Spirit or mind in the Hegelian sense, Geist, is what emerges from the relationships between the neurons, not from the neurons in themselves. Similarly, the spirit of a nation can be defined by the relations between the people. The spirit of 76 is necessarily different from the Nazi German spirit. This comparison reveals that only a minority of intellectuals among the modern revolutionaries fully embrace formal political reductionism, while the American people themselves embraced a national spirit that appears degenerate only in comparison to the more robust state spiritualism of Hegelian or German models. Nietzsche's Übermensch, moreover, while despising German nationalism per se, is nonetheless rooted conceptually in the spiritual ground of the German Uberorganism. Just as Anglo-Saxon freedom implicitly posits an individual whole greater than the sum of its multicellular parts, Troiltsch posited the German idea of liberty as the liberty of an Uberorganism individual greater than the sum of its individual human parts. Here, the individuals do not compose the whole, they identify with it. Liberty is not equality but service by the individual at his place in the function allotted to him. Literally an organ position, Organstellung, point 1172. This is highly reminiscent of Plato's The Republic, wherein justice refers to a city in which every member is dedicated to doing his allotted craft well solely for the sake of the common good. If, as Troiltsch claimed, devotion of the individual to the whole is completed and legitimized, emphasis mine, by the independence and individuality of the free spiritual culture, then the loss of independence and individuality of that culture, culture through conquest, would delegitimize the notion of the devotion of the individual to the whole. If the Norman conquest delegitimized the kin-selective and cultural basis of an Anglo-Saxon uberorganism culture, it would also have delegitimized super-individual or collectivist ideas of liberty, independence, and individuality. Whereas the famous German inclination towards political obedience presumes the existence of a super-individual basis of legitimate authority, Anglo-Saxon liberalism presumes that there exists nothing above the individual, that the political is not qualitatively superior to the sub-political. For the Germans, the socio-biological whole was still intact and its preservation was a living issue. Into the modern era, Anglo-Saxons, by contrast, generally do not believe in a comparable, higher level of order because for them it is dead. This form of the uberorganism idea died among the Anglo-Saxons because the Normans crippled, abused, vivisected, and killed its kin-selective cultural basis. This modern political nihilism did not, however, do away with holism. It only reorganized it. The tendency to believe in distinct races is one kind of holistic bias, just as seeing individuals as wholes unconnected to kin, race, social background, or other connections is another form of holistic bias. Just consider how much effort is required to repress or ignore a single individual's background history to treat that person exclusively as an individual. To do so is to recognize how much effort is devoted to sustaining this curious kind of holism, the holism of viewing individual persons as distinct wholes. The individualism of the human organism is modern holism. Democracy is an attempt to replicate the political master's social division of labor in every individual so that every human organism is an individual whole unto him herself. Anglo-Saxon democracy, at its most idealistic, attempted to establish an order qualitatively different from the Norman yoke. Divided against themselves, wanting power, yet resisting power, some Anglo-Saxon found a new answer, a modern answer, to their dividedness: to be a whole individual. The Anglo-Saxon solution to their political problem was and is to substitute the freedom and wholeness of individual person for the freedom and wholeness of th and group which had breathed its last full breath in 1066. Equality on the individual organism level implies death on an uber-organismic level. Yet equality for individuals has its compensation exactly in freedom from equality on the sub-individual level. In other words, Americans do not apply egalitarianism to the organization of their individual minds. I have yet to see the American project for freedom and equality applied by an individual to free the neurons of his or her brain from mindless obedience to his or her mind. But if the logic of the revolution were to continue, however, why stop there? To overthrow the neurons themselves as individual organisms, they must be reduced to organelles, molecules, and ultimately atoms. An atom, moreover, was once thought to be a literal gestalt or whole, elementary and indivisible, yet the number of subatomic elementary particles discovered will very likely only increase. One definition of the German word Gestalt is the form of an individual person. Holism would be more coherently contrast both organism individualism and uber-organism individualism against an unadulterated materialism where all human things are viewed as physical material, with no special privilege whatsoever over rocks, hypodermic needles, sulfuric acid, or any other example of the physical world. By the standards of the physical sciences, the holistic construct of the bourgeois individual self is a form of romanticism. Unshielded by the Christian valuation of individual souls, science has yet to demonstrate insuperable barriers to the logic of scientific reductionism. It was Christianity that underwrote this modern alternative holism of the Anglo-Saxon afterlife, the holism of a whole human soul conceived as greater than the sum of its biological parts, a holism of the soul incompatible with the classical political holism of Caesar or William the Conqueror. It was the influence of Christianity, valuing each individual as a whole, which provided a stopping point against scientific reductionism that science itself could not justify. The secularized influence of Christianity explains why political reductionism towards total individual rights over any social duties has not led to total anarchy. The cognate unity of Anglo-Saxon and German is evident in that both liberal individualism and National Socialism are expressions of an instinct for unity. German contradictions on the national level are matched by the bourgeois contradictions explicated by Rousseau. The Nazi German rejection of a natural common good between nations was matched by the Anglo-Saxon rejection of a natural common good between the government and common individuals. The difference lay in the implicit Anglo-Saxon acceptance that they ultimately had no formal rights as an ethnic or kinship whole. Individualism implies that the Anglo-Saxon came to accept their defeat as an uber-individual entity. The German acceptance that they had rights on an uber-individual basis is precisely what demanded that German individuals sacrifice some individual rights to social duties. From a purely individualistic perspective, one could look at the Norman conquest and declare, the Anglo-Saxons were never conquered. They were not conquered, from this perspective, because there was no Anglo-Saxon collective. They were only individuals. Yet instead of proving that the Anglo-Saxons were never conquered, what this actually demonstrates is that the ethnocentric refusal to admit the impact of the conquest opened and sustained the American ability to view new immigrant groups, not as foreign invaders, but as new potential individuals. Once again, holism was not destroyed by modernity, only reorganized. Arguments for the superiority of egalitarianism among individuals is a kind of holistic argument, because the West assumes that, on the whole, equal individualism is collectively superior to an egalitarian collectivism. This is where a form of holism necessarily survives in liberal democratic regimes. Modernistic arguments for equality are not so consistently universal that liberal democracy is deemed equal to Stalinism or Nazism. Modern political reductionism to equal individuals was considered superior to the more socially or collectively based regimes it replaced. There would simply be no rational way to argue for regimes that aspire to some form of human equality without asserting that certain forms of egalitarianism are collectively or holistically superior to inegalitarian forms of government. The political is by its very nature is unequal, and nothing better illustrates this point than the application of human equality as a political principle. Political equality, by being political, is to rule over, master, and dominate certain kinds of inequalities against the possibility that the conquerors would take over, dominate, and define the identity of the political whole. The collective individualism of Anglo-Saxons expressed their distinctive ethnocentric individuality as a whole. Chapter break. Tragedy versus tyranny. The Levelers may have been the most democratic political movement in the world. In the 1640s, during the English Civil War, one of their indignant pamphlets charged that William the Conqueror and his successors made dukes, earls, barons and lords of their fellow robbers, rogues and thieves. The Levelers' prescription was rather simple, and therefore away with the pretended power of the lords. 1173. The ambiguity of the word lords is highly significant here. Were all lords or even all rulers tainted, or just these particular descendants of the Norman conquerors represented by the House of Lords? If the source of their animosity was the particular, historic injustice inflicted by the Norman conquerors, then exactly how deep did their democratic radicalism truly run? One leader of the anti-royalist cause, Commissary General Henry Ireton, claimed that he did not wish to derive all our tyranny from the Norman conquest, 1174. But how easily can one separate that particular tyranny from the tyranny of any form of hierarchical government? If all those centuries of subjugation left their cultural mark in the form of conquest phobia, then how could the new Anglo-Saxon hierarchy regenerate without new lords appearing as anything but new tyrants? It does appear that, despite the moral rhetoric, popular support for the Puritan Commonwealth was rooted in the attempt to regenerate a more holistic, more uber-organism-like, political community against the internal class divides left by the conquest. But such unity does not normally come about without some form of patriarchal hierarchy. Under these circumstances, how could one clearly distinguish between the role of the old Norman forefathers and those who claimed to be retaking the throne of their Saxon forefathers? Towards the end of his life, Benjamin Franklin conceded there is a natural inclination in mankind to kingly government. 1175. The Normans exploited and abused this inclination, and the only way to overcome ambivalence between forefather and foefather was to swing radically towards the egalitarian democratic side. New vistas of modernity offered the prospect of clearing the air of all trappings of political patriarchy, inequality, and tyranny. No other basis for Anglo-Saxon unity could be trusted, and this natural ambivalence towards kingly government itself stimulated the modern, analytical reduction of political unity into a political equality. At first glance, German belief in the uber-organism state appears to be distinctly more holistic and less analytical than the modern Anglo-Saxon approach. The superficial assessment itself, however, fails to thoroughly analyze the differences between them. The traditional German ability to make certain kinds of analytical distinctions provided the basis for the kind of holism, the uber-organismic form of holism, that Germans traditionally tend to believe in. The German approach is not fundamentally less analytical than the Anglo-Saxon approach because the latter is derived from a seeming inability to make certain kinds of analytic distinctions that the Germans do tend to make. An example of the kind of political, analytic distinctions that Anglo-Saxons lost the ability to make is the distinction between subjugation and subordination. The mindless obedience with which the Anglo-Saxons submitted to the conquest for so many centuries betrays an original similarity with the German proclivity for subordination to authority. The Germans, however, were never subjugated or conquered in a comparable manner until the 20th century. So while the Germans continue to conceive of their subordination as distinct from subjugation, the Anglo-Saxons move towards a confounding of all subordination with subjugation. The ultimate consequences can be observed through the lens of differential interpretations of Sophocles' Antigone. In this Greek tragedy, two forms of morality come into conflict. On one hand, King Creon decrees that Polynices, killed in a fight for the throne that Creon himself ascended to, should not be given a proper burial. On the other hand, Polynices' sister Antigone rejects her duty to the king, and plans to bury her brother. For the Greeks, this was a tragedy because both claims to duty are right. Antigone had an authentic duty to the king, and she also had an authentic duty to her brother. The distinctly modern view, however, would assume that Antigone was right and Creon was wrong. Antigone's Greek duty to her king would be reinterpreted as her right or liberty to act upon her own will, while Creon would be viewed simply as a tyrant who attempted to violate her rights. Sophocles' Antigone is not a tragedy for moderns because two authentic goods do not come into irreconcilable collision. From the modern view, Antigone is a story of tyranny, not tragedy, because Creon would be considered wrong and Antigone right. To grasp a radical alternative to modern morality, consider the ancient Greek Spartans. At the age of 7, a Spartan boy was permanently removed from his mother's home and thereafter raised in a collective educational system called the Agoge. 1176. By encouraging males to break ties with their family and strengthen ties to their warrior state, the Spartan regime helped preempt a conflict of interest between the family and the highest patriarchal authorities. Among the Spartans, Creon was right and Antigone was wrong, and the Agoge was designed to preclude the tragic possibility represented by Antigone. Since Hegel was one of the few great German philosophers who accepted some of the basic political innovations that define modernity, it is of significance that he considered Antigone to be tragedy par excellence. He held a view of the state wherein political duty had, not unconditional right, but a rightful place. The acceptance of both, certain liberal rights, and certain political duties, assumes the ability to make the distinction between an outright tyrant and legitimate duty to political authorities. Anglo-Saxon thinkers, by contrast, tend to reject the distinction between a tyrant and a legitimate patriarchal father-king figure, subsuming all of these possibilities as antithetical to individual right. While Germans tended to see a legitimate conflict in Antigone, the Anglo-Saxons tend to side with one point of view, the individual who struggles for freedom against tyranny. By accepting the distinction between legitimate duties to a political patriarch and illegitimate duties to a political patriarch, the Germans were able to take the two basic points of view that made Antigone a tragedy to most Greeks, with the possible exception of the Spartans. This cultural difference supports the view of Heidegger and other Germans who claim that German culture was closer to that of the ancient Greeks than the modern civilization of the West. The key point here is that ambivalence towards the Norman conquest establishment eroded the ability of the Anglo-Saxons make clear analytical distinction between kin hierarchy and non-kin hierarchy. It is not, strictly speaking, that Anglo-Saxons are wholly without the ability to make these distinctions. Democracy itself originated out of the desire for the people to make this distinction themselves. Rather, it is that Anglo-Saxons developed a cultural tradition so obsessed with conquering the conquest, that trust in duty to political authorities became permanently shaken. Movements such as fascism or National Socialism are universally condemned because the Anglo-Saxons universalized their adaptation to the struggle against the Norman yoke and this precluded the capacity to make the distinction between forefathers and forefathers. The sense of discontinuity with the political so corrupted their sense of duty that they could not even fathom that there could be a legitimate distinction between a false National Socialism and a continuous National Socialism. In short, the anti-governmentism of anti-Normanism is an overgeneralization derived from the experience of the Norman yoke. Modern humanistic universalism is a flip side of this overgeneralization, the universalization of the view of the conquered over the view of the conquerors. The fuzziness of the overgeneralization called humanism is actually a product of an inability to make certain kinds of distinctions. If the modern, analytic, reductionism of the political into the sub-political is actually based on an inability to make certain kinds of analytical distinctions, then the political cannot be considered fully or universally reducible to the sub-political. While this holistic overgeneralization called humanism is rooted, in part, in Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism, It also entails analytic discriminations between distinct individuals under the political idea of individual human rights. It thus appears that Anglo-Saxons channeled analytic clarity into the political distinction between human individuals because they were unable to clearly distinguish political forefather from political foefather. Conversely, the Germans generally tended to generalize and overgeneralize on the holistic level of human groups because they assumed that Germans themselves formed a distinct, political human group, and extreme generalism comes at the expense of distinguishing individual counterexamples within groups. So, while the traditional German Überorganism model is more synthetic and holistic from some points of view, it is also more analytic from some points of view. The Germans developed a greater capacity for internal sociobiological differentiation, rank among German groups, and this correlated with a greater capacity for external differentiations, rank among non-German groups. Since the Anglo-Saxon socio-biological body had its political head cut off in 1066, they lacked the head's discriminatory faculty for coherently developing a comparable foundational distinction between political insiders and political outsiders. Anglo-Saxon failure to subordinate themselves to the political in 1066 led to subjugation by superior Norman subordination to William the Conqueror. The Nazi Germans, like Harold's Anglo-Saxons, subordinated themselves to native political authorities that were ultimately subjugated by foreigners. Only after that world historical defeat in 1945 were the Germans fit to accept the West's modern democratic identification of subordination and subjugation.